Hello and welcome back to Sire Bellicho. Before we begin, where are you watching from? What time is it? Drop it in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed, do it now. For decades, park rangers have guarded our most remote forests, but they know something we don't. Deep in the wilderness, in absolute darkness, there are things that shouldn't exist. Phenomena that defy explanation. Encounters that leave hardened men questioning their sanity. These stories were never officially reported. Lock your doors. Prepare yourself. Tonight's story is not for the faint of heart. Let's begin. My name is James Smith, and I've been a park ranger for 17 years. Not the kind you see in brochures smiling next to a moose, but the kind who spends 8 months of the year alone in the Alaskan wilderness, monitoring remote territory that most people will never see. I've tracked bears, rescued lost hikers, and documented wildlife patterns that feed into reports nobody reads. I thought I'd seen everything the backcountry had to offer. I was wrong. The assignment came down in late August, 3 weeks before the season shift. My supervisor, Carl, called me into the ranger station at Denali, if you can call it that. It's really just a log structure with filing cabinets and coffee that tastes like it was made in 1993. Carl didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We need you to investigate something," he said, not looking up from his computer screen. "Unusual activity in Sector 7. We've had reports. Sector 7 is the northeastern section of the preserve, roughly 30 square miles of dense forest, alpine meadows, and ravines. It's one of the most remote areas we maintain, and it's where I'd already been scheduled for my fall census work." I asked what kind of reports. "Livestock disappearances," Carl said. 2 ranches bordering the park have lost animals, a moose calf, 3 caribou, and what they claim was a bear kill that didn't look right. This happens regularly. Bears, wolves, and coyotes all live in Sector 7. Property loss is frustrating for the locals, but it's not unusual. I said as much. Carl finally looked at me. His expression was strange, not quite worried, not quite embarrassed. "The kills are wrong, James. The ranchers say the carcasses show predation patterns they've never seen before. Deep puncture wounds, but also signs of something else. Grappling, crushing force. I've seen what happens to prey animals. Bears can crush ribs like they're twigs. Wolves tear and rend. Mountain lions sever the spine." I asked him to be more specific. "The state wildlife people went out. They filed a report saying they couldn't determine the cause. But between you and me, the description they gave me, it sounded like something large, something bipedal. Something that left prints they don't want to officially acknowledge." The word hung in the cabin air like cigarette smoke. "We're not calling it anything," Carl continued. "You're out there doing your regular work. You document what you find. You take photographs if the opportunity presents itself. You don't volunteer information to anyone. You understand?" I understood. We both understood. "The Park Service has a policy about this, or rather, we don't have a policy, which is a way of having a policy. Unconfirmed sightings of large cryptids don't make official records. They make headlines, and headlines make problems. The last thing the park needed was a media circus." "It's probably nothing," Carl said. "Probably just a large bear. But we need to know." I left that meeting with a detailed topographic map, a satellite collar that had stopped transmitting 2 weeks earlier, and instructions to investigate why. The official reason for my extended deployment would be retrieving the collar and monitoring predation patterns. The real reason was to figure out what was leaving those impossible prints. I've never been the superstitious type. I grew up in Michigan, went to university for wildlife management, and built a career on observation and evidence. But as I loaded my supplies into the truck that evening, freeze-dried food, ammunition, thermal imaging equipment, a satellite phone, and a journal to document findings, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. A small, persistent unease. My ex-wife used to say I had no imagination, that I experienced the world too literally. She left 5 years ago, claiming I loved the forest more than I loved her. She wasn't entirely wrong. The forest is honest. It doesn't lie to you about what it is. It's just dangerous, and you respect that danger, and most of the time you come home alive. The drive north toward Sector 7 took 4 hours. The road deteriorates the farther you go, until eventually you're not on a road anymore. You're following tire tracks and hope. The truck bounced over washboard terrain, and I watched the landscape shift from transitional forest to true wilderness. By the time I reached the ranger shelter, a small plywood structure with a wood stove and a roof that mostly worked, The sun was already dropping behind the northern peaks. Twilight in September in Alaska doesn't last long. The darkness comes on fast. I spent that first night reading through the reports Carl had printed for me. The official documentation from the state was vague, exactly as he'd promised. Predation signs consistent with large mammal predator. Causal factors undetermined. Recommend increased surveillance. But there was more. Carl had also left me photocopies of the rancher's complaints, submitted to the local board of supervisors. These were less careful. The first rancher, Tom Hendricks, wrote about finding his moose calf torn nearly in half but not eaten, barely eaten, like whatever got it just wanted to tear it apart. There was blood 20 feet up the side of his cabin, on the walls, up the posts. He described finding one of the calf's hooves on the roof. The second rancher, Bill Kashani, was more clinical. He described 5 puncture wounds arranged in a pattern that didn't match any predator he'd ever seen. The marks were deep, some reaching the sternum, but the most disturbing detail was that the animal had been dragged. Kashani followed the drag marks for nearly a quarter mile, through thick forest, over terrain that should have left a clear trail. But there were no prints, not clear ones, just displaced undergrowth and snapped branches, as if something large was dragging its prey without leaving clear impressions. The most recent incident was 3 days before my arrival. A caribou, partially consumed, found in a ravine. This time there were prints, or partial prints. The state report mentioned them only in passing, in a single sentence. Large track evidence recovered. Dimensions approximate to known megafauna or anomalous bear track distortion. I wanted to see that track. I secured the shelter, set out my sleeping gear, and attempted to review the hand-drawn map Carl had marked. Sector 7 was roughly divided into 3 patrol zones. The livestock incidents had all occurred on the western border, at the edge of Kashani's property. The rover collar that had stopped transmitting was supposedly somewhere in the central zone, near a series of thermal springs that attracted wildlife during the fall transition. But the map was hand-drawn and approximate. Nobody had a perfect survey of Sector 7. That's partly why it remained untouched, a last place where the park existed as it had for thousands of years. I lay in my sleeping bag that night and listened to the wind moving through the trees. The forest around the shelter was old growth, spruce and pine that had been there longer than my country. The darkness was complete. My headlamp made a small circle of light that seemed to make the surrounding black deeper, more absolute. I'm not a nervous person, but that night I lay awake for a long time and I found myself checking the rifle I'd propped beside my bunk. I told myself I was checking to ensure the safety was on. I was lying. The thing about Sector 7 is that it was genuinely remote. More than half of it had never been systematically surveyed. We knew what animals were out there: bears, wolves, moose, caribou, smaller prey. But we didn't know the territory intimately. We couldn't. It was too vast, and we had too few people. As I finally drifted toward sleep, I kept thinking about the state wildlife official's report. Anomalous bear track distortion. That phrase seemed chosen specifically to explain away what couldn't be easily explained. It would be my last night of real comfort for quite some time. I spent the first 2 days establishing a camp deeper in Sector 7, moving toward the central zone and the last known position of the rover collar. The forest here was different from the margins, denser, older, and somehow less hospitable to human presence. The undergrowth was thick, the canopy high, and the air felt heavier. On the morning of the 3rd day, I found the first clear prints. I was moving through a meadow southeast of the thermal springs, a landscape transition area where forest gave way to open ground. Elk and caribou favor these spaces, so apparently do other things. The print was in soft ground near a stream, ancient, undisturbed meadow soil that held impressions clearly. My first thought was that it was a bear track, a large one. But as I knelt beside it, I felt my mind struggle to process what I was seeing. The shape was wrong. Too long, too narrow. The toe arrangement didn't match any bear I'd ever documented. Bears have 5 toes with a distinctive claw pattern. This print showed what appeared to be 4 main digits and a smaller opposing thumb-like structure. The ball of the foot was massive, easily the size of my hand, and the heel was raised and defined. It looked almost human. Except the total length was 17 inches. I took careful photographs using a scale ruler placed beside the impression. I marked the GPS coordinates. I even removed my boot and placed my foot against the print. My size 11 foot fit inside it with room to spare. I told myself it was an anomaly, a deformed bear track, overlaid with something else. The state report about track distortion suddenly made sense. but not in the way intended. Whatever these people had seen, they documented it carefully enough to know something was wrong, then filed their report in language designed to make the observation go away. I moved methodically through the meadow, spiraling outward from the initial print. Over the next hour, I found 5 more impressions. They led north, toward thicker forest, in a pattern that suggested a purposeful walk. No dragging, no sign of injured mobility. Whatever had made them was traveling with intent. The prints were heavy. I could see that from the depth and the way the earth had been displaced around each impression. These were made by something weighing at least 400 pounds. I followed the trail into the forest. This was not protocol. Protocol is to document, take photographs, file reports. But I was alone, and protocol assumes resources that don't exist at the margins of wilderness management. I followed the prints. The trail led me deeper into Sector 7, toward a series of rocky ridges that bordered the thermal springs. The ground became harder as I moved upslope, and the prints became harder to follow. But the broken branches and displaced moss told a story of something moving through here recently. Days recent, not weeks. I found the carcass near sunset. It was a moose calf, partially hidden in a ravine. The smell hit me before I saw it. Not the smell of rot, but the smell of death, fresh and recent. I descended carefully, my rifle held ready, though I couldn't have explained to anyone why I felt the need. The kill was exactly as the reports had described. The animal had been torn apart with extreme violence. Ribs were shattered outward, the sternum crushed. The legs were broken in ways that made no sense, snapped at angles that required deliberate force, not just predation. One foreleg was missing entirely. But the most striking thing was what remained of the head. The calf's skull had been crushed, not eaten, crushed. The bone was fractured and splintered in a pattern that suggested it had been gripped in something, held in place, and squeezed until it broke. The mouth and throat area showed deep lacerations, long parallel marks that looked almost like rake wounds. I spent an hour documenting the scene, photographs, measurements, GPS coordinates, my observations in the field journal. The calf had been here for at least a week, maybe longer. The ambient temperature in the ravine was cool, so decomposition was slowed. But insects were already at work, and the smell was becoming overwhelming. As I climbed back out of the ravine, I noticed something else. A massive print in the soft earth near the carcass. This one was even larger than the ones in the meadow, and it was recent. The edges were still sharp. This thing had been here in the last day or two. Night was falling fast. I made a decision I'd never made before in 17 years of ranger work. I decided not to press on back to my camp. Instead, I climbed into a tall spruce about a quarter mile from the kill site, made a platform in the heavy lower branches, and secured myself there. I didn't have a tent. I had a thermal poncho and a sleeping bag, and I arranged them in the branches like a nest. I kept the rifle across my lap, and I checked the safety repeatedly, almost obsessively, until I was certain it was ready to fire. The forest around me settled into night sounds. The wind in the needles, water moving through the distant streams, small animals moving through the undergrowth. But underneath all of it, I felt like I was listening for something else, something large. Something that didn't belong in the normal pattern of Alaskan predators. I didn't sleep that night. I'd like to say I was vigilant, ready to document anything that happened. The truth was simpler. I was afraid. In the early morning, maybe 3 hours after full darkness, I heard movement. It wasn't the movement of any animal I could identify. It was heavy, deliberate, and organized. Something large was moving through the forest below my tree, and it was moving with purpose. The sound of branches breaking was distinct, individual, not the chaotic crashing of an animal in panic or hunger. I activated my thermal imaging viewer, an expensive piece of equipment I was supposed to use only for documented research purposes. I pointed it down into the darkness below. What I saw in that thermal image is something I've thought about every night for the past 6 months. It was a silhouette, unmistakably bipedal. It walked on 2 legs, moving upright through the forest. The thermal signature showed it as a massive heat source, easily 6 feet tall, maybe taller. It moved past the base of my tree without pausing, moving in the direction of the kill site. I lost the image as it moved beyond my viewing angle. I could have adjusted, could have moved to follow it. Instead, I sat very still in my tree, my breathing shallow, and I watched the darkness below with every sense heightened. For the next hour, I listened. The forest had gone quiet. Nothing was moving. Then, around 4 in the morning, I heard something that will stay with me for the rest of my life. It was a sound like vocalization, almost like a roar, except it was too controlled, too structured. It had variations in pitch and duration that suggested something approaching language or expression. It echoed through the ravine and the forest, and then it was answered by another sound, from a different direction, farther away, but answering in kind. There were two of them. I remained in the tree as the sun rose. The sound stopped as dawn approached. By first light, the forest had returned to normal bird calls and wind sound. Nothing suggested that anything unusual had happened, but I knew it had. And I knew that my 17 years of straightforward predator management had just ended. I returned to my base camp the following day with 13 photographs, detailed GPS coordinates, and a kill site documented to Park Service standards. I filed my initial report electronically, using the satellite connection, and waited for responses. Carl called me via the satellite phone that evening. "Tell me," he said without preamble. I told him everything except the bipedal silhouette and the vocalization. I reported the prints, the body, the evidence of predation patterns. I left out the part about my night in the tree and what I'd seen through the thermal viewer. There was a long silence. "We need to talk about what you found," Carl finally said, "but not over this connection. Continue your work. Get me everything you can document. But James, be very careful, and don't talk to anyone else about this. Not the other rangers, not the local law enforcement, no one." The call ended. I sat in my shelter and reread my field notes, wondering what I'd left out and why it felt important to leave it out. Over the next 3 weeks, I established a systematic survey pattern through Sector 7. I was ostensibly looking for the lost rover collar, but I was actually doing something else. I was mapping behavior. I was searching for evidence of a population, not just a single animal. What I found was disturbing. There were prints in 3 different locations suggesting at least 2 separate animals. The feeding sites I discovered, 4 additional kill sites in a roughly circular pattern, showed varied predation patterns. Some kills were consumption-focused, like a normal predator. Others showed the same senseless destruction I'd seen on the first carcass. The prints at each location were different sizes. One set was massive, suggesting an animal approaching or exceeding 7 feet. Others were smaller, maybe 5.5 feet. I documented 17 separate distinct prints across the kill sites, but the most significant discovery came at a location I found almost by accident, a cave system in the Rocky Ridge system east of the thermal springs. The cave was large, the entrance roughly 10 feet high and 8 feet wide. The ground at the entrance was heavily used. There were prints everywhere, partially obscured by recent wind and weather, but clearly representing multiple visits over an extended period. I didn't enter the cave, I'm not a fool, but I documented the entrance, the prints, and the evidence that whatever was making these kills had a base of operations. This wasn't a transient predator passing through Sector 7. These were residents. The evidence was becoming undeniable, at least to me. But evidence of what? That was the question I didn't want to answer, because answering it would mean accepting something that contradicted everything I'd built my career and worldview around. On October 4th, I found what might have been a clue, or might have been a delusion born from weeks of isolation and stress. I was near the thermal springs, checking on mineral content and wildlife patterns around the warm water. This was legitimate work, part of my survey responsibilities. The area was heavily used: elk prints, wolf tracks, the track pattern of a brown bear. And mixed with all of this, more of those 17-inch prints. These were fresh, maybe a day or 2 old, but there was something else near the spring itself. An object, partially obscured under a lip of overhanging rock. I almost walked past it, but something made me stop. It was a piece of fabric, tan-colored, maybe cotton canvas. It was wedged under the rock, half buried in sediment and lichen. I carefully extracted it without disturbing the surrounding area. It was a patch perhaps 6 inches square, the kind that might come from a jacket or backpack, and there were stitches around the edge suggesting it had been deliberately cut from something larger. But what struck me most was what was on the patch: a logo, faded, partially disintegrated, but still readable. It was a State Park Service emblem, the kind of patch that would be on an official ranger jacket. My chest constricted. I checked my satellite phone for any news of missing rangers. Nothing. But this patch had been here for weeks, maybe months, partially degraded by weather. It could have come from anywhere. It could have been dropped by any ranger who'd worked Sector 7 in the past year. I photographed it carefully and placed it in a sample bag. I didn't remove it from the site immediately. That felt wrong, like disturbing evidence of something I didn't yet understand. That night, I made the decision that changed everything. I called Carl directly on the satellite phone. "I need you to tell me," I said, "if anyone has gone missing in Sector 7 in the past 2 years." The pause that followed was longer than comfortable. "Where did this come from?" Carl finally asked. I told him about the patch. I heard him breathe deeply on the other end of the line. "There was someone," Carl said quietly, "2 years ago, before I was supervisor here. A ranger named Mitchell. He was doing a survey in Sector 7 and didn't return. His truck was found at the ranger shelter, but Mitchell was never located. The official report was that he'd gotten lost, possibly injured. Search and rescue went through the area for a week but found nothing. The case was eventually classified as unresolved." My mouth was dry. What was Mitchell's name? His first name? Michael Mitchell. I had nothing more to say. Carl continued. "I wasn't going to tell you about Mitchell until you'd completed your survey. I wanted to know what you'd find before I influenced your investigation. But it's clear you're finding things that matter. What do you think is happening out there?" "I don't know," I said truthfully. "But I think you need to consider closing Sector 7 to all activities, civilian and official." "I can't do that without justifying it," Carl said. "The park will want an explanation. I'll need a complete report from you. And James, I need you to be careful about what you claim. We're dealing with something here that careers don't survive." The conversation ended. I was alone again with my evidence, my photographs, and the terrible knowledge that I might not be investigating something new. I might be investigating something that had been happening quietly and without official acknowledgement for years. On October 9th, I found Michael Mitchell's remains. The remains were in the cave system. I finally entered it on my 4th exploration of the entrance area, after I'd documented every external detail. I carried my rifle, my thermal viewer, and my field journal. I carried them like weapons, or prayers, or both. The cave entrance led into a passage that angled downward and inward. The thermal imaging showed that the cave was warmer than the exterior, geothermal activity probably feeding from the springs above. The warmth distorted the thermal images, but I could navigate by the visible light that penetrated from the entrance. About 40 feet in, the passage widened into a chamber, and the smell hit me like a physical blow. It was the smell of death and decomposition, but also something else, something organic but wrong. The heat was making it worse, accelerating decay, creating a miasma that made my eyes water and my stomach clench. I moved deeper, my footsteps echoing slightly against the stone walls. The chamber extended farther than I'd expected, and as my eyes adjusted, I began to make out details. Bones scattered across the floor in a pattern that suggested neither natural disposal nor organized butchering. Animal bones, mostly elk, moose, deer, but mixed among them larger objects that hurt to look at. I found a vertebra that was clearly human. The geometry was unmistakable, and nearby a femur that was far too large for any animal that should be in Alaska. I found the remains of Michael Mitchell approximately 30 feet into the cave, partially covered by recent rockfall and sediment. His decomposed skeleton was still partially bound in what remained of his ranger jacket. The condition was advanced. 2 years of microbial activity, insects, and exposure to the geothermal heat had rendered him largely skeletal, but enough remained to tell a story. His left arm bone showed traumatic fracture, not a single clean break, but multiple compound fractures that suggested tremendous violence. His ribs were crushed, the sternum fractured. His skull was like the moose calves, crushed and fragmented. He'd been gripped, held, and broken. I documented it all. Photographs that seemed obscene in their precision, measurements, GPS coordinates. I marked the location in my field journal with the same clinical notation I used for any biological finding. Then I did something that violated every protocol. I carefully removed several of Mitchell's personal items, his ranger badge, his watch, a ring that might have been significant. I placed them in separate evidence bags, and I took them with me. The walk out of that cave was the longest walk I've ever taken. The stones seemed to narrow around me, the air seemed thicker, the echoes of my footsteps seemed to mock the pretense that this was just another investigative task. I emerged into late afternoon light. The sun was already dropping toward the horizon, casting long shadows through the spruce forest. For a moment I just stood there breathing hard, trying to process the weight of what I'd found. Then I realized something was wrong. The forest had gone silent, completely silent. No birds, no movement in the undergrowth, no distant wind, just the sound of my own breathing and the movement of my boots on the ground. I turned slowly, scanning the forest with every sense heightened, And I saw them. There were 3 of them, standing in a line perhaps 30 meters away, partially obscured by trees but clearly visible. They were massive, covered in dark fur, and unmistakably bipedal. They were watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. They didn't move, they just watched. I brought my rifle up slowly, not threateningly, just ready. The safety was off. My hand was steady, which surprised me. I'd expected to be terrified. Instead, I felt a strange clarity. "Don't come any closer," I said aloud, which was probably the stupidest thing I could have done. The largest of the 3 tilted its head slightly. The gesture was so human, so clearly one of contemplation or confusion, that it broke something in my mind. This wasn't a bear. This wasn't an anomalous predator. This was something that thought, that processed, that made decisions. They didn't charge. They didn't attack. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds, they turned and melted back into the forest. I could hear them moving, large bodies crashing through vegetation, but they were moving away. I stood there for a long time after they disappeared. Then I walked back to my camp, moving fast but not running, keeping the rifle ready, checking the forest constantly. That night, I made my decision. I could file a complete report. I could detail everything I'd found: the prints, the kills, the cave system, the skeletal remains of Michael Mitchell. I could provide photographs and evidence and demand that Sector 7 be investigated thoroughly. But I knew what would happen. The Park Service would launch an official investigation. There would be teams, equipment, publicity. There would be attempts to establish contact, perhaps even to capture one of these animals. There would be a spectacle. And these creatures, because I was certain now that's what they were, and certain also that they were intelligent, would be either hunted to extinction or captured for study. Or worse, Mitchell had violated their territory. Mitchell had died for it. But the violation had been his choice. It didn't give us the right to turn Sector 7 into a war zone. I spent that night writing a false report. I documented the physical findings, the kills, the predation pattern, the mysterious cave system, but I attributed them to a large predator, possibly an unusually large bear. I wrote about the patches, but I suggested it was decades old, possibly from the 1970s. I made the evidence ambiguous, deniable, explainable. I did not mention the prints. I did not mention Michael Mitchell. And I certainly did not mention what I'd seen standing in the forest, watching me with eyes that held intention. I submitted the report to Carl. His response came back almost immediately, via satellite email. "This is a strong find. Unusual predation patterns warrant careful monitoring. Recommend limited expanded surveying in adjacent sectors. Well done, James. Take the rest of your deployment for standard census work. No need for additional Sector 7 investigation at this time." Carl understood. Without stating it directly, without even acknowledging the truth in any way that could be documented, he understood what I'd decided, and he was thanking me for it. I spent the final 3 weeks of my deployment in Sector 5, documenting standard wildlife patterns, recovering the rover collar which was working fine just outside communication range, and waiting for the season to end. On October 31st, I drove back toward Denali, toward Carl's station, toward the world of reports and protocols and the careful maintenance of a version of reality that everyone could live with. As I drove, I thought about Michael Mitchell, and I thought about the creatures in that forest, and I thought about the patch of ranger jacket that I'd removed from its resting place and brought with me, hidden in my personal effects. The Park Service had a policy about things like this. Not an explicit policy, but a real one nonetheless. You document what can be documented, you report what can be reported, and you protect what needs protecting, even if it means protecting it from the full weight of official investigation. I've been a ranger for 17 years. In that time, I've come to believe that wilderness exists in a balance between the human world that tries to understand it and control it, and the wild world that exists outside our comprehension. My job has always been to maintain that balance. Michael Mitchell had failed to maintain it. He'd violated a boundary, real or imagined, and he'd paid the price. I will not make that mistake. Sector 7 remains on my patrol schedule. I monitor it from the periphery. I document the standard wildlife patterns. And every autumn, when the season brings me to that place, I leave a mark on the trees, a ranger's mark, unmistakable, that says, "I acknowledge your presence. I will not intrude." The kills have continued, but they've moved to the eastern portions of Sector 7, away from the ranger station, away from regular patrol routes. It's almost as if they're maintaining their own boundary, acknowledging my acknowledgement. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if these creatures are capable of such complex reasoning and communication. I only know what I've observed, and I only know what I've chosen to report. Sometimes I think about Michael Mitchell, and I wonder if he'd made the same choice, if he'd walked out of that cave and decided to let the wild remain wild, whether he'd still be alive. I'll never know. What I do know is this: there are places on this planet where we don't belong. Places that existed long before we drew borders and made maps and declared them ours to manage. Sector 7 is one of those places, and some boundaries, once recognized, should never be crossed. I remain a park ranger. I monitor, I document, I protect. But I do it with the knowledge now that protection sometimes means protection from human interference. On quiet nights, when I'm alone in my ranger shelter and the wind is moving through the distant peaks, I sometimes hear sounds from the direction of Sector 7. Sounds that might be wind or might be something else. I don't investigate. Some mysteries, I've learned, are meant to remain mysterious. If you're listening to this, I need you to do two things before I tell you what happened. First, don't post this anywhere. Not yet. Second, look up Frederick County, Maryland on a map and find the green stretch of mountains north of the city. That's Catoctin. That's where I worked. That's where it lives. My name is Nathan Bryant. I was a federal park ranger for 7 years before I transferred to Catoctin Mountain Park in the spring of last year. I'm using past tense because I'm not a ranger anymore. I'm not allowed to be. The paperwork says medical retirement, but the truth is more complicated and a lot less merciful. I'm recording this from a motel room about 90 miles south of where it happened. I keep the chain on the door. I keep the bathroom light on. I haven't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since I got out of the hospital. Every time the ice machine drops a load, I'm out of bed with my hand on the pistol on the nightstand. The motel manager thinks I'm a tweaker. Let her think that. She doesn't know what I know. I'm telling this story because the man who had my job before me left a notebook in the bottom drawer of the ranger station, and that notebook is the reason I'm alive. I owe him this much. His name was Edward Butler. He disappeared on the 2nd of November in 2019. They never found him. They never will. I know because I saw what was wearing his uniform. Let me start at the beginning. I drove up to Catoctin on a Tuesday in early April. The dogwoods were just starting to turn, that particular shade of off-white that only lasts about a week before the petals brown and drop. The mountains there aren't tall the way the Rockies or the Sierras are tall. They're old, worn down. The locals call them mountains, but a Coloradoan would call them hills. They lean against each other like tired men, and the valleys between them hold mist until almost noon, even in summer. The supervisor who met me at the visitor center was a woman named Patricia Foster, late 50s, hair cut short and gray the way a lot of women out there cut their hair. She shook my hand and looked me over like she was checking a horse for soundness. Whatever she saw, she seemed satisfied with it. She walked me through the basics: trail map, radio frequencies, the 2 campgrounds, the presidential retreat to the north that we did not discuss with visitors and never approached on patrol. I would have my own cabin about 3 miles from the visitor center, on a service road that didn't show up on the public maps. The cabin had been Edward Butler's before mine. She mentioned him by name only once, on that first day. We were standing on the porch of the cabin and she had handed me the keys. She said, "Edward kept things tidy. You'll find his system if you look for it. He was a good ranger." I asked what happened to him. She looked out at the trees for a long moment. Then she said, "He went out on a routine patrol and didn't come back. We searched for 2 months, K-9 teams, helicopters, volunteers from 3 counties. Nothing, not a button, not a boot print. The Park Service classified it as a presumed fatal accident 18 months ago." She paused. "He was a friend of mine, Nathan. I'd appreciate it if you didn't go digging around in his cabin looking for souvenirs. The man deserves his privacy." I told her I understood. I meant it at the time. She left before sundown, and that first night I unpacked alone. The cabin was a single room with a kitchenette and a small bathroom, wood stove in the corner, a steel desk under the window, a bunk bed against the far wall. Butler had left it neat the way a man who expected to come back leaves a place. A clean coffee mug upside down on the drain board, a pair of work boots by the door, polished, a wool blanket folded at the foot of the bottom bunk. Even his calendar was still pinned up on the wall, frozen on October of 2019, with 2 appointments written in pencil for early November that he never kept. I'd been in plenty of cabins like that. The Park Service is bad about clearing out the personal effects of rangers who die or go missing on the job. There's always paperwork to wait on, next of kin to locate, so I didn't think much of it at first. I want to be honest with you. I'd heard stories before I took the job. Every park has its stories. Yellowstone has the bears that aren't bears. Yosemite has the people who walk into the woods and never come out, and the people who walk out who aren't the same people. Glacier has the things that mimic. Catoctin had the snallygaster. I'd laughed about it, frankly. The local tourism board had leaned into the legend in a kitsy way. There were snallygaster t-shirts at the gas station in Thurmont. There was a craft beer with a cartoon version of the creature on the can. I bought one, the first night, and drank it on the porch while the dark came down through the oaks. I remember thinking it was a sweeter beer than I usually liked. The story, the way the Chamber of Commerce told it, was this. The snallygaster was a creature reported in central Maryland from at least the 1730s. German settlers called it the Schnellergeist, the quick spirit. It had a single eye, a beak of metal, leathery wings, and tentacles that hung from its underside. It drank blood, it carried off livestock and sometimes children. There were sworn statements about it filed in newspapers in 1909. Theodore Roosevelt was supposedly going to come hunt it. In the early 1930s, federal prohibition agents poured a vat of confiscated moonshine into a den on South Mountain, and the creature was reported to have drowned in the liquor. End of legend. Punchline. The snallygaster was a creature you could fit on a beer can. That was what I believed when I drank that beer on the porch. The first thing that bothered me was the barns. I started doing my patrols on day 2. The park has a lot of public-facing trails, but it also borders private land, and one of my responsibilities was to maintain a relationship with the farmers whose property abutted ours. So I drove the perimeter on the 3rd morning. Got out at each gate, made introductions, dropped off my card. About 6 miles in, I noticed the painted stars. They were tin, a couple of them, but most were painted directly onto the wood. Always on the doors of the older barns, always 7-pointed, always with a kind of swirling pattern inside, sometimes red, sometimes black, sometimes a pale yellow that had faded to almost nothing. I counted 12 of them on 12 different properties before I stopped counting. I asked one of the farmers, an older man named Joseph Richardson, what the stars meant. He had a gray beard cut square at the bottom, and the kind of forearms you get from 60 years of fence work. He looked at me for a beat too long before he answered. Hex signs, he said. My grandfather painted ours. His grandfather before him. Hex signs against what? He shrugged. Bad luck. Storm damage, you know. All 12 of your neighbors have them too. It's a tradition, he said. Pennsylvania Dutch. Folks brought it down with them when they settled this county. That was a reasonable answer. I should have left it alone. But there was something in his face when he said it, the way a man's eyes go when he's telling you a true thing that isn't the whole thing. I'd seen that look before, on parents whose kids had gone missing and who knew, in the marrow of them, that their kid hadn't just wandered off. I thanked him for his time and drove back to my cabin, and that night I started looking through Edward Butler's desk. I told myself I was looking for old patrol logs, the kind of thing that helps a new ranger learn the land. That was a lie I was telling myself. I was looking for him. The bottom drawer was locked. The other drawers weren't. I went through them first. Pencils, topo maps, receipts for diesel, a photograph of a black lab, paw print on the back in ballpoint pen, a name I couldn't read, a sealed envelope addressed to a woman in Hagerstown. I left that envelope where I found it. I'm not sure why. I think I knew, even then, that opening other men's mail in that cabin would lead somewhere I didn't want to go. The locked drawer I had to jimmy with a flathead screwdriver. The lock was cheap. It gave on the second try. Inside the drawer there was a notebook. Black cover, the kind you get at a feed store. There was a service revolver, an older one, oiled and loaded with 5 rounds of what looked like custom ammunition, brass casings with dull silver tips. There was a photograph of 7 men standing in front of a sealed cave mouth, taken in what looked like the late 1930s, all of them holding rifles. And there was a folded county map with a single red X drawn on a section of forest about 4 miles north of my cabin. I sat down on the floor of that cabin with the notebook in my lap and I opened it. The first entry was dated June of 2018. It was Edward Butler's handwriting. I confirmed that later against his patrol logs. The first entry said, "The old man Joseph R. came to the visitor center today. He told me that the seal at the den has cracked and asked whether the new ranger would understand what that means. I told him I did not know what he was talking about. He said I would. He said it always picks one of us, eventually, and that I should be ready. I read that entry 3 times. Then I closed the notebook and set it on the desk and walked outside, and the night had come down complete by then, and I stood on the porch and listened. The cicadas were out, the first heavy chorus of the season. Then far away, deep in the trees on the slope above my cabin, something else, a sound I couldn't place. It was high and it was metallic, like a long blade dragged slowly across a piece of sheet tin. It went on for maybe 4 seconds. Then it stopped, and the cicadas, which had been at full volume, stopped too. The woods were silent for almost a full minute. Then the cicadas started up again, but quieter now, like something had passed by and they were waiting to be sure it was gone. I went back inside. I locked the door, which I had not bothered to lock the night before, and I read the rest of the notebook by the light of the kerosene lamp until I reached the last entry, which was dated the 1st of November 2019, the day before he disappeared. That entry said only this: "It knows my name now. God help whoever finds this." I didn't sleep that first night with the notebook. I read it twice through, then a third time, going back to the entries that didn't make sense and trying to make them fit a shape I could recognize. Edward Butler had been at Catoctin for 14 years. He'd kept that notebook for the last 18 months of his career. The early entries were mundane, the kind of off-the-record observations any veteran ranger keeps. A note about a bear sow with 3 cubs on the southern slope. A note about meth cookers using one of the abandoned hunting cabins. A note about a missing hiker who turned up 2 days later in a Frederick hospital, dehydrated but alive. Then in October of 2018, the entries changed. He started to write about Joseph Richardson. He started to write about the families. There were 12 farms on the perimeter of the park, 12 7-pointed stars, and Butler had drawn a map of them in the back of the notebook, with notes about who lived on each farm and how long their family had been on the land. Some of those families had been there since the 1750s. The 12 farms formed a rough circle around a section of forest in the northern part of the park, a section that was off-trail, deep, full of rhododendron thickets so dense you couldn't push a body through them without a machete and an hour's patience. Butler had drawn an X in the center of that circle, the same X as on the folded map in his drawer. The entries from late 2018 were notes from conversations with old men. Joseph Richardson had told him things, so had a man named Henry Collins, who lived on a farm at the southwest corner of the circle, and a woman named Patricia Foster, who I was startled to recognize as my new supervisor. According to those notes, here is what those old men and that one woman had told Edward Butler. In 1932, after Prohibition agents poured 120 gallons of illegal moonshine into a cave on South Mountain, the creature inside had not died. It had been driven mad. It had come out of that cave in early spring of 1933, and it had taken livestock and 1 child from a farm near Sabiasville before the families on the perimeter, the same 12 families, had come together and done something to push it back underground. Butler did not write down what they did. He only wrote they sealed it with what was sealed before, which I took to mean nothing and everything. After the sealing, an arrangement was made. The 12 families would keep the seal. They would pass the responsibility down through their children, and once a year, in late October, they would leave a quantity of livestock at the mouth of the den. Sheep, mostly. Sometimes a calf. The creature would feed, and the seal would hold, and the woods around Catoctin Mountain would remain quiet. The 7-pointed stars on the barns were not Pennsylvania Dutch hex signs. They were marks of the families who had taken the oath. Anyone outside that circle was prey. Anyone inside it was protected. Edward Butler had asked Joseph Richardson why he was being told this. Richardson had told him that the seal was failing. The families were getting old. Their children had gone to Frederick or Baltimore or Washington, married outside the county, sold off pieces of their land. There weren't 12 full families anymore. There were maybe 7, and some of those 7 were thin. The annual offering had been short for 3 years running. The thing under the mountain was waking up. And Butler, as the federal ranger, was the only person with both the authority to walk into the woods unchallenged and the obligation to do something about it. I read all of this on my first night at Catoctin, in a small cabin at the end of a service road, with my doors locked and my supervisor's name in a notebook I was not supposed to have. You can imagine what I thought. I thought Edward Butler had lost his mind. I thought he had been a good ranger for 14 years and then something had cracked in him. the way it cracks in some men who spend too long alone, and he had gotten taken in by a piece of folk theater that the local farmers had been performing for their own amusement for 200 years. I thought he had wandered off into the woods looking for a cave that didn't exist and died of exposure or a fall, and I thought I would put the notebook back in the drawer and lock it and forget about it. I drove into Thurmont the next morning. I went to the diner where the local farmers ate breakfast, the one with the orange vinyl booths and the cracked Formica counter, and I sat at the counter and ordered eggs and listened. The men at the booth behind me were talking about a calf that had been killed on a farm out by Lewistown. Drained of blood, they said. Punctures on the throat, 2 of them about an inch apart. The county was telling people it was coyotes. The men in the booth did not think it was coyotes. One of them said, "That's the 3rd one this month." Another said, "Henry's getting too old to keep up with it." A third said, "We should talk to the new ranger." The first one said, "The new ranger doesn't know yet." I paid my check and left without finishing my eggs. I drove back up the mountain and I stopped at Joseph Richardson's farm and I knocked on his door, and when he opened it I told him I had read the notebook. He looked at me for a long time, then he held the door open and stepped aside. His kitchen smelled like coffee and wood smoke. There were dried herbs hanging from the ceiling and a black iron skillet on the stove. He sat me down at his kitchen table and he poured me a cup of coffee and he said, "What did Edward tell you?" I told him everything I had read. The arrangement, the offering, the seal, the 12 families. He listened without interrupting. When I was done, he said, "Edward got it about right. He missed a few things, but mostly right." "Mr. Richardson," I said, "I have to ask you, what happened to him?" The old man set his coffee cup down. He looked out the window. The morning sun was coming through the curtains and lighting up the dust motes between us. "He went out to the den," Richardson said. "He told me the night before. He said he was going to look at it, to see for himself. I told him not to. I told him there was nothing to see that wouldn't see him back. He went anyway." "Did you go after him?" "We searched. The whole circle searched. We were the first ones up there, before the K9 teams, before the helicopters. We found his radio. We found his hat. We did not find him." "What did you find at the den?" He looked at me then. There was something in his face that I had to keep myself from looking away from. "The seal was open," he said. "Not broken. Open. Like a door someone had walked through and pulled shut behind them." I sat with that for a long moment. "Mr. Richardson," I said, "I need you to take me there." He shook his head. "No, son, you don't want that." "I'm a federal officer," I said. "A man in my position is missing and presumed dead, and you are telling me you know where he went. I am telling you with respect that you will take me to that location, or I will make a call that ends with the FBI on your porch by Thursday." He looked at me a long time after I said that. Then he said, "I'll take you tomorrow at first light. But I want you to do something tonight first." "What?" "I want you to sit on your porch and listen. After it gets full dark, I want you to hear what's up there. And then I want you to decide in the morning whether you still want me to take you to it. If you do, I will. If you don't, I'll understand and I'll never speak of it to you again. Either way is a choice a man can make." I told him that was fair. I went back to my cabin. I cleaned the revolver in Butler's drawer. I checked the silver-tipped rounds. I made a sandwich I couldn't eat. And when the dark came down at about 8:15, I took a folding chair out onto the porch, and I sat, and I listened. For the first hour there was nothing but the cicadas and a barred owl somewhere down the slope. Then, around 9:30, the cicadas stopped. It was that same metal-on-metal sound from the first night, but closer this time, maybe a half-mile up the slope. It went on for almost 10 seconds. Then there was a wet sound, hard to describe, like a heavy sack being dragged through mud. Then the metal sound again, briefer. Then I heard very clearly a man's voice call my name. "Nathan." The voice was familiar. I had heard it before, but I could not place where. "Nathan, come here." The cicadas had not started back up. I did not call back. I sat on that porch with the revolver in my lap and I did not move. After about a minute the voice spoke a third time. It said, "Nathan, it's Edward. I came back. Come help me." That was when I knew where I had heard the voice. I had not heard it. I had read it. The cadence of his sentences in the notebook, the little verbal tics, the way he started declarative statements with the subject pronoun, the way he repeated the name of the person he was speaking to. Whatever was up there, it had read his notebook too, or it had taken the voice straight out of him. I went inside. I shut the door. I locked it. I did not sleep. In the morning, Joseph Richardson knocked on my cabin door at 5:15. I opened it. He looked at my face and he nodded once. "You heard it," he said. "I heard it. Still want to go?" "Yes." He looked at me for a beat. "All right," he said. "Bring the gun, bring the silver, and do exactly what I tell you to do." We went on foot. Richardson said vehicles spooked it, and we did not want it spooked. He carried an old break-action shotgun that had been his father's, loaded with shells he had loaded himself. He would not tell me what was in them. He said only, "The same thing's in yours." The hike was about 2 miles up from his back pasture. The first mile was through cleared woodlot, the trees spaced and the underbrush light. The second mile changed. The rhododendron began about where the slope started to steepen, and within 20 minutes we were pushing through thickets so dense I could not see Richardson 3 feet ahead of me. There was no trail. He moved by memory, ducking branches I had to fight, sliding through gaps that closed behind him before I reached them. He stopped about an hour in at the base of a rock outcrop that I would never have found on my own. He held up his hand. We listened. The woods were not silent. They were quiet, which is different. There were birds, far off. There was wind in the high canopy, but there was nothing close. No squirrel chatter, no insect noise, none of the small motion that fills a healthy forest. Richardson pointed up the outcrop. I climbed it after him. At the top, on a small flat shelf about 30 feet up, there was a cleft in the limestone. The cleft was maybe 4 feet wide and 7 feet tall. It had been sealed once with mortared field stones, and a cross of iron rods had been set into the mortar. The mortar had cracked. The stones had fallen inward. The cross was bent, not broken, but bent the way a hand bends a soft piece of wire. The opening behind it was black, a black that didn't seem to take light. I shone my flashlight into it and the beam went about 6 feet and then stopped, the way a beam stops in heavy fog. The smell coming out of that cleft was the smell of something that had been dead for a long time and was not finished. Richardson stood beside me and said, in a voice almost too low to hear, "This is where Edward came. This is where the seal failed." "How long ago did it fail?" 3 years now. We've been keeping it fed since. It's not enough anymore. Why not? Because once they get the taste, they want more of it, and they remember which kind they liked. I knew what he meant. I did not ask him to elaborate. We did not enter the cleft. Richardson said no man living had been inside and come back the same. We worked instead at the entrance. He had brought a satchel of tools. Iron stakes the length of my forearm, a small bag of mortar mix, a canteen of water, and a folded square of cloth that had been wrapped around a circle of beaten lead. The lead disc was about the size of a saucer, and there were marks pressed into it that looked like letters but were not letters from any alphabet I knew. He set me to mixing the mortar. He worked the iron stakes back into the cracks where the old cross had been. He set the lead disc in the very center of the cleft, and he pressed it into the freshly mortared stone. And as he did it, he said something under his breath that I could not make out and did not ask him to repeat. We worked for almost 2 hours. The sun moved, the shadows in the trees changed. When we were almost done, when Richardson was setting the last stones into place, the woods around us went silent again. Not the gradual quiet of birds settling at noon, the sudden absence of birds at all. Richardson froze, his hands were full of mortar and his back was to the open part of the cleft. He whispered without turning, "Don't look at it. Whatever you do, son, do not look at it." I will tell you that I tried. I tried very hard. I had my back to a thicket of rhododendron, about 10 feet from the outcrop, and I was facing the cleft, which Richardson was sealing. Whatever came out of the trees came from behind me. I heard it. It was the metal sound, very close now, the long, slow drag of a blade across tin, and then it was the sound of something settling onto the rock a few feet behind me. Something heavy, something with too many points of contact. The smell was the smell from the cleft, but worse, fresher. I did not turn around. I did not turn around because Richardson had told me not to, and because some animal part of me, the part that has kept human beings alive for 200,000 years, knew without asking that turning around would be the last thing I ever did. But I saw it anyway. I saw it because the cleft we were sealing had a vein of quartz running through the limestone above the opening, and that quartz was wet with seep water, and the wet quartz was a mirror, dim and warped, but a mirror. I saw a shape behind me that was not the shape of any animal I had ever seen. I will try to describe it the way I saw it in that wet stone, and you will have to forgive me if the description is incomplete because I only let my eyes rest on it for half a second before I forced them back to Richardson's hands and the mortar. It was tall. It stood on legs that bent the wrong way, the back joints behind it instead of below it, like a heron's legs but on a body the size of a draft horse. It had folded wings of a leathery skin, dark, and the wings were folded against its sides the way a bat folds wings, but the wings were attached at the shoulder and at the hip, so that the whole body of it was shrouded. It had one eye. The eye was forward, centered above a beak that looked like beaten copper, dull and dented and old. From the underside of its body, between the legs, there hung a clutch of long boneless arms, ropey, the color of the inside of an oyster, 5 of them. 6. I could not count. But what I remember most, what I will remember when I am dying, is that the beak was open and there was something inside the beak. Not teeth, a face. A small, pale, human face, set far back in the throat where the tongue should be, and the face was looking at me, and the face had Edward Butler's eyes. I made a sound. I could not help it. It was small. It was the sound a dog makes when it is afraid of something it does not understand. The thing on the rock behind me made a sound back. It was the same sound, an exact copy. The tone, the pitch, the catch in the throat. It mimicked me. Richardson's hands did not stop moving. He was setting the last stone. He was almost done. The thing took a step closer to me. I felt the air shift behind my back. Then it spoke, but it did not speak in my voice. It spoke in Edward Butler's voice, the voice I had heard from the porch the night before, calm and clear and reasonable. It said, "Nathan, turn around. I want to show you something." I closed my eyes. I heard Richardson behind me whisper, "One more." He pressed the last stone into the mortar. I heard him scrape his trowel one last time across the seam. The thing behind me said again, "Nathan, turn around." Richardson said in a louder voice now, the first loud voice of the day, "It's set." He said something else after that, the same thing he had been saying under his breath as he worked, but louder this time, almost shouted, in a language I did not know. The words were short and hard, full of consonants. The thing behind me made a sound that I will not try to describe. It was high and it was metallic and it was full of something that was almost grief. Then the air moved. I felt the wind of something large passing through space. The smell sharpened and then receded. I heard branches crack at the edge of the clearing, a heavy passage through the rhododendron, the sound of something pulling itself away. I opened my eyes when Richardson touched my shoulder. The clearing was empty. The cleft was sealed. The lead disc gleamed in the new mortar like a coin set in fresh bread. Richardson was breathing hard. He was an old man, and the work and the fear had taken something out of him, and he sat down heavily on a stone and put his hands on his knees. "It's not gone," he said. "Just back inside. The seal will hold for a while. Not as long as it used to, but a while." "How long?" "Long enough for me to die," he said. "Past that, son, that's your problem." I looked at him. "Mine." "You read the notebook. Edward chose you. The thing that came out tonight knew your name. It only knew my name because it heard you say it." He looked at me with a kind of pity then. "It knew your name before you got here," he said. "It knew your name when the Park Service hired you. It always knows the next one. That's how it eats." We came down off the mountain in silence after that. He walked ahead of me slower than he had on the way up. When we reached his pasture, the sun was going down. He turned to me at the gate and he said, "Come for dinner tomorrow. I'll explain the rest." I did not go to dinner the next day. I went back to my cabin, and I packed my truck, and I drove. I made it as far as the foot of the service road before I saw the figure standing in the middle of it. He was wearing a Park Service uniform. The uniform was filthy, mud-stained, the sleeves torn. He stood with his back to my headlights. His shoulders were the shoulders of a man Edward Butler's height. The Park Service patch on his sleeve was the right patch. He did not turn around. He said, in Butler's voice, "Nathan, come here. I want to show you something." I put the truck in reverse and I drove backward up the service road for almost a mile before I dared to turn around. That was the night I called Patricia Foster. Patricia Foster met me at the diner in Thurmont the next morning, the same diner where I had heard the men talk about the Lewistown calf. She looked at me when I came in, and she did not look surprised to see me, and she did not look surprised to see the state I was in. I sat down across from her. I did not order anything. I told her quietly that I had read Edward Butler's notebook. I told her I had been up to the cleft with Joseph Richardson. I told her what I had seen on the service road the night before. She listened without interrupting. When I was done, she folded her hands on the table and she said, "Edward did not choose you, Nathan. I did." I did not say anything. "Joseph believes Edward chose his successor by leaving the notebook," she said. "Joseph believes a lot of things. Joseph is an old man with a long family memory and a great deal of fear. But the truth is that I am the one who decides which ranger gets sent up here. I have been deciding it for 19 years. There is a list of qualifications. You met them. What qualifications? No close family, no spouse, no children, a reputation for keeping your mouth shut, a clean disciplinary record so that nothing you say later, if you say anything later, will be believed. I felt something cold come into me when she said that. Why? Because the seal needs maintenance. Because Joseph and the others are old. Because there are not 12 families anymore, and the offering is no longer enough. Because the Park Service has unparalleled access to that mountain, and a federal officer has the authority to close trails and reroute hikers and keep witnesses out, and a single ranger living in a single cabin is the cleanest way to manage a problem that has been managed in this county for almost 300 years. You sent Butler up there to die. I sent Edward up there to maintain the seal. He died because he went into the den. I told him not to go into the den. I am telling you not to go into the den. You can do this job for 30 years and retire and never see the thing if you do it correctly. I saw it yesterday. Joseph took you to it. That was Joseph's choice. Joseph is in his way trying to do you a kindness. He believes that a man who has seen it cannot leave it. He believes that the only way for the next ranger to take the work seriously is to know what the work is. She paused. She turned her coffee cup in its saucer. He may be right about that, she said. I have always disagreed with him. I have always thought it was kinder to keep the rangers in ignorance and let them feel that they were maintaining a strange but reasonable arrangement with eccentric local farmers. Edward agreed with me, until he didn't. Edward got curious. You see what curiosity buys in this country. I sat there for a long time. The waitress came and went. Patricia ordered me a coffee that I did not drink. I said eventually, what about the figure on the road last night? She looked at her hands. That is the part, she said, that I cannot explain, and that none of us can explain, and that nobody wants to talk about. The thing under the mountain copies what it eats. Voice, manner, sometimes face. It uses what it has copied to call the next one in. We do not know if anything of Edward is left in there. We hope not. If you see him again, you do not approach. If he speaks to you, you do not answer. If you answer, the next time he comes, he will be closer. And if I leave the county, if I quit and drive west and never come back, then you live a long life. The thing is bound to the mountain. The seal limits it. It cannot follow you. But the next ranger I hire will see the figure on the road, and the figure will have a different uniform, and the voice eventually will be yours. I looked at her. I tried to hate her. I could not quite, because she was not lying to me, and she was not enjoying any of it, and there was a tiredness in her face that was the tiredness of a woman who had been carrying a thing too heavy for too long. I said I quit. She nodded. I expected that. I'll write it up today. Take a week. The medical retirement papers are easier if you take a week. I can have them ready by Friday. Patricia, I said, what happens to you when you retire? She smiled. It was not a happy smile. I have a cabin in Vermont. My sister left me. I'm going there. I'm going to stay there. I'm going to drink decent wine and read books I have been putting off. I'm going to do my best to forget the names of every farmer in this county. Some nights I expect I will not succeed. But I have done my term. I trained Edward, and Edward did not survive his, and now I have hired you, and you are quitting, and I will hire someone else next month and the work will go on. That is the entirety of what I am willing to tell you about my future, Nathan. I would rather not be asked again. I took the week. I packed Edward Butler's cabin. I did not take the notebook. I left it on the desk where I had found it, with a sticky note on it that said, to the next ranger, read this on your first night. I do not know if Patricia threw the note away. I do not know if she replaced the notebook with one of her own. I do not know who is in that cabin now. I asked once after I left, and the answer I got from a friend in the regional office was that there had been a transfer in May and the new ranger seemed to be settling in well. I did not ask the new ranger's name. I do not want to know it. I do not want to hear it later in a voice on a porch. I drove down off Catoctin on the last Friday of April. The dogwoods had finished. The redbuds were at their peak, the pink shocking against the new green. The mountains looked, from a distance, exactly like the mountains I had seen on my first morning, soft and old and tired. Nothing about them, from the highway, suggested what they held. I have been in this motel for 3 months. I move every 6 weeks. I move because I am afraid, even though Patricia told me the thing cannot leave the mountain. I am afraid because of the figure on the service road. I am afraid because once a thing has worn your name, I do not entirely believe that any seal binds it. I am recording this because I have decided that the next ranger has a right to know, and because I do not believe Patricia will tell him. I am recording this because Edward Butler left a notebook, and that notebook saved my life. And I owe him a notebook of my own, even if mine is digital, even if mine is just a voice in a file. If you are the new ranger, if you are sitting in that cabin tonight and you have found this recording on a thumb drive that someone slipped under your door, then I want you to listen to me very carefully. The notebook in the bottom drawer is real. The 7 pointed stars are real. Joseph Richardson, if he is still alive, will tell you the truth if you ask him directly. Patricia Foster, if she has not retired by the time you read this, will tell you a managed truth that is meant to keep you at your post. Do this for me. Do not go into the den. Do not turn around when something behind you calls your name. Do not answer it the first time. Do not answer it the second time. If you decide to leave, leave fast. Do not pack neatly. Do not say goodbye. Drive at night, with the windows up, and do not stop in the county for any reason. And if when you are at the foot of the service road you see a figure standing in your headlights wearing a Park Service uniform, a figure who does not turn around, a figure who calls you by a name you recognize, I want you to know that the figure is not me. I am alive. I am in a motel south of you. The figure is something the mountain is wearing, the way it wore Edward, the way someday it will wear whoever comes after you. Drive past it. Do not look at its face. That is all I have to tell you. Good luck. End of recording. My name is Richard Davis, and I've spent the last 16 years working for the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, managing the backcountry areas of Shawnee National Forest. I've seen black bears, mountain lions, and hikers push themselves to the edge of survival in the rugged southern Illinois wilderness. I've responded to rescues, maintained trail systems, and walked these ancient forests in every season. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I encountered during the autumn of 2019 in the most remote sections of the forest. What I'm about to tell you is something I've never fully shared with anyone, not even my supervisors. It took me years to stop second-guessing what I experienced, years to stop looking for rational explanations where none existed. I'm sharing this now because I think someone else might encounter what I did, and they deserve to know the truth about what lives in those hills. October arrives in Shawnee like a closing door. The season shifts fast, tourists thin out by late September, and by October the forest becomes a different place entirely, quieter, more primal. That's when the real work starts for those of us who stay year-round. We're the ones who monitor the trails as the weather begins to turn hostile, who check on remote structures, who make sure everything is secured before the worst of winter hits. It's solitary work, and I prefer it that way. I was stationed at Bellsmith Springs Station that October, one of the most isolated posts in the forest. From there, I managed the backcountry trails leading into the eastern wilderness, areas where cell service doesn't exist and help is hours away by vehicle. I knew every ravine, every ridge, every campsite within my territory. I had the maps memorized. I could navigate those trails in the dark if necessary, and twice I'd had to do exactly that. The first indication that something was wrong came on October 12th, a Saturday. A hiker hadn't returned from the Garden of the Gods trail. His name was William Jones. According to his permit, he was supposed to return on October 10th. When he didn't, his sister called the main office in Springfield, which filtered down to me. William was experienced. That's what his sister kept saying when she called back asking for updates. Experienced hikers understand weather, understand their limitations, understand how quickly things can go wrong in the southern Illinois wilderness. But experienced hikers also tend to push themselves. They think their skills can overcome anything the hills throw at them. What I found when I hiked to his last registered campsite, roughly 9 miles from the trailhead near Pounds Hollow, was disturbing. His tent was still there, zipped shut from the inside. His sleeping bag was inside. His backpack was inside, mostly untouched. But William wasn't there. The strangest part was the condition of the tent. The fabric had been slashed, multiple cuts, aggressive ones from the outside. His boot prints led away from the camp into the forest, heading northeast into higher elevation terrain that had no established trails. I followed the prints as far as I could. They went about a quarter mile before they simply ended. No signs of a fall, no indication of struggle beyond the frantic, erratic pattern of his movement. It was as if he'd simply vanished into the hillside itself. The formal search that followed involved rangers from other sectors, volunteer searchers, and search parties covering the ravines and ridges. We found nothing. William Jones had effectively disappeared, and in the official report, his disappearance was attributed to severe disorientation, likely exposure, and the assumption that he'd died somewhere in the rugged backcountry, his body too difficult to find in the dense forest. But I knew better. I knew because of what I found near his camp. Scratched into an old hickory tree, about 8 feet up the trunk, too high for William to have reached easily, were marks, deep gouges in the bark, as if made by something with thick, clawed hands. The pattern wasn't random. It was almost deliberate, almost like a message. I photographed that tree, kept those photos to myself. 2 weeks later, another hiker didn't return. This one was a solo female hiker named Rebecca Ortiz, attempting a through hike from the eastern trailhead to the western ridge system, a 3-day journey in good weather. She'd signed her permit on October 21st, was supposed to return on October 24th. She didn't. I found her campsite, about 6 miles in, showing the same signs. Tent slashed from the outside, gear intact, footprints leading away in a panic pattern toward higher elevation. By now I was noticing something that terrified me more than anything else. The animals in the area were gone. The normal forest sounds, wood thrushes, squirrels, the occasional elk bugle, had ceased. I'd spend entire days on the trails and hear nothing but wind and my own breathing. The forest felt emptied out, as if everything was hiding from something. After Rebecca's disappearance, I called my supervisor, James Smith, and asked about the history of incidents in my area. I was careful about how I phrased it, framing it as an academic interest in forest history and safety protocols. He told me there had been disappearances before, a few stretching back decades. 3 in the 1980s, 2 in the 1990s, 1 in the early 2000s. All hikers, all solo, all disappeared from the remote eastern trails. All assumed to be accidents, all impossible to investigate conclusively due to terrain and dense vegetation. Statistically, James told me over the phone, the wilderness takes its due. People underestimate these hills. I wasn't sure if I believed that anymore. The third disappearance should have triggered a closure of the eastern backcountry trails. It didn't. The missing hiker's name was Brandon Clark, a 32-year-old from Carbondale with extensive hiking experience. He'd gone in on October 28th, planned to spend 5 days exploring the higher elevations around Panther Den Bluff. He submitted a detailed route plan, checked in with the station, and seemed to understand the risks. I was standing in the ranger station when his emergency contact called on November 4th, frantic that he hadn't made his checkout call. I felt something cold move through my chest. I knew what was coming. I organized the search myself this time, and I made sure to get out there first, before the volunteer teams arrived. I needed to see the campsite before anyone else could. Brandon's camp was different from the others. There was no slash tent. Instead, there were what appeared to be massive footprints surrounding the camp, at least 3 separate tracks that I could identify before rain covered the details. They were enormous, easily 12 to 14 inches long, with a bipedal pattern that no animal in Illinois should produce. Around the camp, in a rough circle, were markers. Branches torn from trees and arranged in a deliberate pattern, twisted together in ways that seemed almost like a language I couldn't understand. Scratch marks on surrounding trees, deep gouges that descended in a regular pattern as if something had been marking territory. Brandon's final entry in his trail journal was barely legible. Heard it twice tonight. It sounds like something drowning, like something trying to scream and breathe at the same time. The trees around the camp, they're damaged, torn. I can feel it out there. I can feel it watching me. I'm moving higher tomorrow. I have to move now. This time I submitted a formal report documenting the similarities between the disappearances. The investigation that followed concluded that the scratches on trees were consistent with known animal behavior, bears and cougars marking territory, branch damage from wind and weather. My supervisor called me in early November to discuss my mental health. He wasn't unkind about it, but the implication was clear. I was stressed, isolated in a remote post, and potentially reading threat into normal wilderness phenomena. I didn't argue. I also didn't back down from what I believed I'd seen. Instead, I decided I needed to see it again. I needed to understand what was happening in those hills. On November 5th, I went in alone. I brought standard ranger equipment, but I also brought something else, a .308 hunting rifle and ammunition. It was a violation of protocol, and if discovered, it would end my career. But I needed to be armed. The forest was dead silent. No birds, no small mammals, nothing. It was like hiking through a museum exhibit of a forest rather than an actual living ecosystem. On the second night, at approximately 2:47 a.m. according to my watch, I heard it. The sound was exactly like Brandon had described it. It wasn't quite a scream and it wasn't quite a howl. It was something like a human voice pushed through an animal's anatomy, a sound that no single creature should be capable of producing. It was wet, somehow, as if something was making the sound from deep within a throat full of fluid or blood. It echoed through the ravines, and the echo made it sound like multiple things were calling at once. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with the rifle across my lap, and I listened. That sound came at irregular intervals, sometimes minutes apart, sometimes with long silences between calls. Each time it came, it sounded closer. By dawn, I was shaking from cold and adrenaline. What I found instead were more of the branched markers, more of the scratches on trees, and a smell. It was a smell like rotting meat and copper and something else I couldn't identify. The smell made my eyes water and my stomach turn. That's when I saw the prints in the mud. They were massive, much larger than the ones I'd seen at Brandon's camp. The prints were deep and deliberate. They showed claw marks at the front, and the weight distribution suggested something moving on two legs, carrying an enormous mass. I didn't follow them. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me not to follow those prints. The hike out took me most of the day. By the time I reached the station, I was exhausted and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. But something had changed. After that night, I understood that we weren't dealing with a normal predator. Normal predators don't leave markers. Normal predators don't make sounds like drowning men. Normal predators don't seem to be hunting in a way that suggested intelligence and intent. I started researching. In the evenings, using the internet at the station, I began looking into historical accounts of strange creatures reported in wilderness areas. I found references to something called a Wendigo, a creature from Algonquian folklore, said to inhabit the far north, but accounts of similar creatures throughout the eastern forests of North America, a thing that was neither quite animal nor quite human. The more I read, the more the descriptions seemed to match what I was encountering. November in the hills is brutal. Rain turns to sleet, temperatures drop, and the backcountry becomes increasingly difficult to traverse. The eastern trails were functionally closing as winter approached. This meant that if something was hunting in these hills, it was hunting with limited prey, unless it decided to come looking. The first indication that something had changed came on November 18th. I was conducting a routine check on remote structures. I was hiking to one of these shelters, Panther Bluff Shelter, about 5 miles from the Bell Smith Springs station. When I arrived, I found the door forced open. The hinges had been torn from the frame. Inside, the structure was destroyed. The cot had been shredded, literally torn to pieces. Supplies were scattered everywhere. Most disturbing were the claw marks. They covered every interior surface, walls, ceiling, floor, but the shelter had been empty. Whatever had done this had done it to an empty building. It felt like a message. That night, I reinforced the station. I placed the rifle within reach of my bunk. I set up motion sensors outside. The thing came on November 22nd. I was awake. I'd barely slept in days when the motion sensors went off. All of them simultaneously. Whatever was outside had circled the building. I grabbed the rifle and moved to the window. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I could hear something moving. Something heavy. The sound was the worst part. It moved around the station, making that sound, that wet, drowning scream that was almost human but not quite. It circled the building 3 times, and each circuit seemed to take longer, as if it was deliberately lingering. But after that 3rd circuit, the sound stopped. The motion sensors went silent. Whatever was out there pulled back into the darkness. By the time the sun came up, my hands were numb from gripping the rifle. The area around the station showed no tracks, but there were claw marks on the corner of the building, fresh ones, high up on the wooden siding. I made a decision that day. I was going to see this thing. I was going to face it directly. I began studying the disappearance patterns. The missing hikers had all been taken from specific elevation ranges, all within a few miles of each other. I plotted the locations on a detailed topographic map. The line seemed to be centered on Panther Den Bluff, the highest point in my sector. On November 26th, I geared up for what I knew might be my last expedition in those hills. I packed heavy, food for 5 days, camping equipment, the rifle, ammunition, and a flare gun. I followed the line that the disappearances had traced. I was heading toward Panther Den, toward the highest, most remote part of my territory. I was hiking upward, into thinner air and deeper cold, moving deliberately toward whatever was out there. On the first night at elevation, I heard it again. The sound was closer now, within a few hundred yards. It called multiple times that night. The echoes in the ravines made it nearly impossible to pinpoint, but the general direction seemed to be coming from even higher elevation. On the second day, I found the first body. It was William Jones. He was suspended in the branches of a large oak tree, his body contorted into an unnatural position. His clothing was in tatters. His skin was visible in many places, and it was discolored, a sickly purple-black. The positioning of his body suggested he hadn't died in the tree. His injuries suggested he'd been moved there after death, arranged deliberately in the branches. I forced myself to document what I saw. I took photographs, but I didn't linger. I continued higher. On the third day, I found Rebecca. She was in a cave, a natural rock shelter on the face of the bluff. Her body was more deteriorated. She was laid out on a bed of branches and what looked like woven grass. She was surrounded by the marked branches, the same configuration I'd seen at the campsites. Her hands were crossed over her chest. It was almost ceremonial. The cave itself was larger than I'd initially realized. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized it extended back into the mountain. I could hear water dripping somewhere in that darkness, and I could smell that terrible smell. I marked the location on my GPS. I told myself I would report it, but I knew I would never report this location, not exactly because I didn't want anyone else coming here. Not yet. That night I camped high on the slopes. The wind was severe, and the temperature dropped sharply. I huddled in my sleeping bag, the rifle beside me, and I waited. The thing came at 3 a.m. It didn't announce itself. I simply became aware that I wasn't alone. There was a presence just beyond my field of vision. I grabbed the rifle and swung it toward the movement. For just a moment I saw it. It was bipedal, standing on what looked like human legs but grotesquely elongated. Its body was covered in dark hair, but there was something else, something that looked like exposed flesh. Its arms were immensely long and muscled. Its hands were huge, with claws that gleamed. Its face was where my mind started to break apart. It was a face that was almost human, but distorted in every possible way. The jaw was too large, the mouth too wide. Its eyes were intelligent. They held intention and awareness. The thing was approximately 7 feet tall, maybe taller. It looked starving, even though I could see traces of what might be blood on its mouth and chin. For maybe 2 seconds I stared at it, and it stared at me. Then I reacted. I fired. The rifle shot echoed off the bluff. The creature screamed, that wet, drowning sound, and it moved with a speed that seemed impossible. I broke camp and started descending as fast as I could move in the darkness. By the time dawn came, I'd descended several hundred feet, moving through the lower forest, moving towards safety. I made it back to the station on November 30th. I'd been gone 4 days. I was exhausted, malnourished, and traumatized. I never reported what I'd found. I made the decision during the long hike back, and I haven't wavered from it in the years since. The official story is that the 3 missing hikers met with misfortune in the backcountry. The records show their cases as closed and unsolved, with the presumption of death by natural causes or accident. I have photos of the cave on my personal computer. I have GPS coordinates locked away. I have the memory of that moment on the mountainside, when I looked into the eyes of something that was neither animal nor man. I didn't return to the eastern backcountry after that expedition. I requested a transfer to a different sector, and my request was approved. In the years since, I've researched extensively. I've found references to the Wendigo in academic texts, but there are accounts from other locations in the eastern wilderness. Multiple missing person cases in the Appalachian region and throughout the eastern forests, dating back decades, with similar circumstances. I think about Brandon Clark, Rebecca Ortiz, and William Jones. I think about their families, who never got closure. I carry that guilt with me. The eastern backcountry is rarely used now. Most of that area is technically still open to hiking, but the reputation of the region, strange disappearances, unsolved cases, has scared off most hikers. I still work for the Department of Natural Resources, but I do it from a safe distance now, from areas where the darkness isn't quite so complete. If you're hiking alone in these hills, and you hear something that sounds like a human voice trying to scream and breathe at the same time, something that echoes through the ravines from seemingly everywhere at once, don't investigate. Just run. Run as hard as you can in the opposite direction and don't look back. Because out there in the deep places where the hills meet the sky, something is watching. Something is always watching, and it is older than the forest, older than the trails, older than our names for these mountains. It was here first, and unlike us, it isn't going anywhere. I've worked for the National Park Service for 13 years, and in all that time, I've never been assigned to a sector I actively didn't want. Until now. The Boundary Waters region sits on the edge of Minnesota and Ontario, a sprawling wilderness where the forest doesn't feel like it belongs to anyone anymore, not even to the government that technically oversees it. It's untamed in a way that most protected lands aren't. That's the appeal for some. For me, after a decade of safer postings, it felt like exile. The briefing happened in August, 2 days before I was supposed to report to my new station. My supervisor, Margaret, barely met my eyes. "We're reorganizing the northern routes," she said, sliding a folder across her desk. "We need someone experienced, someone who won't panic if things get remote." "Remote?" I asked. "It's already remote." "More remote," she said quietly. I didn't ask what she meant. I'd learned long ago that the things left unsaid in this job were usually the things worth worrying about. The drive north took 8 hours. I passed through a landscape that gradually shed its civilization like skin until the towns became logging camps, the camps became rest stops, and the rest stops became isolated ranger stations. Mine was the last one before the real wilderness began, a small wooden building with solar panels and a satellite phone, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. The previous ranger, a man named David, had left a note. "The equipment is functional. The emergency beacon works. Don't go north of the creek after dark. I'm putting in a transfer request." That was it? No explanation, no detail, just a warning that felt like it came from someone who'd learned the hard way. I was 34 years old, in good shape, trained in wilderness survival and emergency response. I wasn't the type to get spooked easily, so I took the note as paranoia from someone burnt out, filed it away, and settled into the routine of my new post. For the first 3 weeks, everything was normal. I did my patrols, checked on the handful of permitted campsites in my jurisdiction, filed reports. The forest was beautiful in that cold, northern way. The trees packed so densely you couldn't see more than a few hundred feet in any direction. The sky perpetually gray, the temperature dropping steadily as autumn crept in. Then the tourist reported something wrong. A couple from Minneapolis had rented one of the permitted sites near the Boundary Waters proper. They were experienced campers, the kind who knew the difference between a moose call and an echo. When they came back to town 2 days early, they went straight to the local authorities with a story. They'd heard something in the forest at night, something that sounded like a person calling for help, but wrong somehow. The sound was distorted, broken, like someone had taken human speech and run it through something that understood language but didn't quite know how to replicate it. It kept coming from different angles. East one moment, west the next. It would drop to a whisper you had to strain to hear, then suddenly spike so loud it seemed to be coming from inside their tent. The woman had wanted to leave immediately. The man insisted they were probably hearing an animal, a loon maybe, or a coyote. But on the second night, when the sound came again, he agreed it wasn't anything native to the region. They packed up and left. The report reached me through the regional office on a Tuesday. They wanted me to investigate, file a full report, and potentially issue new safety advisories if there was something unusual about the area. That meant hiking out to the site, checking for signs of a person in distress or an animal that might pose a risk. It meant going into the forest deeper than I had before. I prepared like I always do for a 3-day expedition. Water filters, dehydrated meals, medical kit, emergency beacon, rifle, flares. I told the office my expected return date and checked in one more time before I left. Margaret had called personally to wish me luck, which was unusual enough that I almost called her back to ask what she knew. I didn't. The hike to the campsite took most of the day. I moved slowly, deliberately, taking note of any signs of unusual animal activity or human presence. I saw nothing. The forest was quiet in the way forests always are. Birds, wind, the movement of small things in the undergrowth. But underneath, there was a kind of silence that felt intentional, like the place itself was holding its breath. The campsite was small and empty. The couple had left it clean, packed out their trash. There was nothing visibly wrong with the place. No signs of an animal attack, no human remains, no blood. I set up my camp about 50 yards away, made dinner, and settled in for the night with my equipment checked and my knife within easy reach. The darkness at the boundary waters is complete. There's no nearby civilization to cast any glow on the horizon, no distant lights, nothing but the absolute absence of illumination under a thick canopy. I've camped in darkness plenty of times, but that first night felt different. The darkness seemed to have weight. It came around 2 in the morning. I was awake not because I heard it at first, but because I felt it. A presence in the forest, something large enough to displace the air, moving with a strange, uneven gait. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the tent flap. Nothing, just trees and shadows. Then I heard it. It was exactly like the couple had described. A human voice calling out but fractured. Like someone was mimicking speech without understanding it, hitting the sounds in almost the right order but not quite. It might have been my name. It sounded like it could have been Carter, but stretched and twisted until I couldn't be sure. The sound came from the east. I aimed my flashlight that direction and saw nothing but forest. I waited, listening, every muscle tense. Minutes passed. The forest held its silence again, but I could feel the presence still there, waiting just outside the reach of my light. Then it moved. I heard it clearly. A sound like something massive pushing through the undergrowth, branches snapping, the ground trembling slightly. It circled the campsite, staying just outside my light's radius. Once, I caught what might have been an eye reflecting back. A glint of something wet and pale, positioned too high to belong to any animal I knew. When it called again, it was directly behind my tent. I spun around, flashlight up, rifle ready. There was nothing there. It didn't attack. It didn't charge. It simply moved through the forest like it owned it, making no effort to hide anymore. And then it was gone. The presence vanished all at once, like it had simply decided to leave. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When dawn came, I searched the area methodically. I found tracks, not footprints, not exactly, but deep impressions in the soft ground where something heavy had stood. The spacing was wrong for a bear or moose. The stride was too long, the pattern too deliberate, and the placement of whatever had made them suggested something that walked on 2 legs, though not like any biped I'd ever encountered. I also found scat. Large, dark, containing what looked like bone fragments and hair. Animal matter, certainly, but the composition was wrong, the color was wrong. And underneath the animal smell, there was something else, something that made my stomach turn. I reported back to the station and filed a full incident report. I wrote down everything I'd heard and seen, trying to maintain professional language. I noted the tracks and the possibility of an unidentified large predator. I didn't write down what I actually believed, because I didn't have the words for it. Margaret called me within an hour. "You need to leave that sector immediately," she said without preamble. "Pack a bag with essentials and drive south tonight." "It's just an animal," I said, not believing my own words. "It's not," she said, and I could hear the exhaustion in her voice. "It hasn't been just an animal for a long time. Go south, Carter. That's not a request." "Why didn't anyone tell me?" I asked. There was a long pause. "Because no one would have taken the job if we had," she said quietly. "Get out." But I didn't leave, not that night, because as I was packing, I thought about David's note. I thought about what he'd written about the creek, about staying north of it after dark. And I realized that if I ran now, if I abandoned the post without understanding what I was actually dealing with, I'd spend the rest of my life wondering. So I made a decision that I'd regret for the next 4 days. I decided to hunt it instead. The forest revealed its nature slowly once I committed to understanding it. The first thing I learned was that the creature, and I stopped calling it an animal after that first night, had territory. Its range covered roughly 12 square miles, centered on a deep ravine that cut through the forest like a scar. The ravine was old, probably carved out by a river in some previous age, but the river was long gone. What remained was a deep chasm filled with shadow and the smell of rot. I found the boundary of its territory on my second day of deliberate investigation. There were markers, though not the kind an animal would make. Branches were broken in patterns too methodical to be random. Trees were stripped of bark in deliberate sections, and on one old pine something had carved marks into the trunk, deep gouges that almost looked like writing, though nothing in any human language I recognized. I camped at the territory boundary that night and set up motion-activated recording equipment, basic thermal imaging cameras and audio recorders, the kind the Park Service uses to monitor wildlife. I'd tell the office later that I was conducting a full ecological survey. It was half true. The creature came shortly after nightfall. This time I saw it. Not clearly, the darkness and the trees obscured most of it, but enough to know that what I was dealing with transcended the categories I'd been using. The shape was roughly humanoid, but wrong, too tall, with limbs that bent in places that shouldn't bend. The head was elongated, and when it turned toward my camp, I caught a glimpse of the face. I've spent 13 years in the wilderness and seen animals in all their natural variety. Nothing prepared me for that face. It had eyes, too many of them, or perhaps not enough. A mouth that extended too far, and underneath it all, something that might have been skin but looked more like it had been carefully constructed as an imitation of skin, with the joints visible beneath, the texture wrong, the color somewhere between gray and brown, and something without a name. It didn't approach the camp. It stood at the edge of the light from my fire, studying me with something that felt like curiosity. And then it opened its mouth. The sound it made was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It started as a moan, genuinely pained, genuinely desperate, and then shifted. The moan twisted into words, nearly words, sounds that had the structure of language but carried no meaning. It cycled through them rapid fire, sounds that almost formed my name, sounds that almost formed the word ranger, sounds that almost formed help and please and come. It was trying, earnestly, deliberately trying to mimic human speech. I grabbed the rifle. Not to shoot, I don't think bullets would have done much to it, but to hold something familiar, something that represented the rules of the world I understood. The creature watched me, and I watched it, and we existed in that moment outside normal time. Then it dropped back into the forest, and I heard it moving away, crashing through the undergrowth without any attempt to hide. This time it was deliberately announcing its departure. My hands shook for an hour after it left. I'd seen something that the world had told me didn't exist, and the implications of that were too large to fully contemplate. So I did what I do in the field when situations become overwhelming. I collected data. I reviewed the footage from my cameras. The thermal images had captured the moment clearly enough. A bipedal creature, humanoid in shape but anatomically distorted. Temperature reading was low, around 94 degrees, which was consistent with an animal that lived in a cold environment, but which was also alarmingly close to the lower limits of human body temperature. I sent those images to Margaret via secure email. She called within 30 minutes. "You need to confirm it," she said. "Document it clearly. Then you need to make a choice." "What choice?" I asked. "Whether you're going to tell anyone or whether you're going to let it remain a myth," she said. "Because once you go public with something like this, Carter, the world changes. The creature's territory becomes a location of interest. Scientists," she caught herself, corrected. "Researchers descend. The ecosystem becomes compromised, and the creature becomes a target." "It's killing things," I said. "The scat I found, it's hungry," Margaret said simply. "And it's been hungry in that forest for possibly centuries. One creature, staying within its territory, maintaining a balance. That's not a threat to civilization. But once you report this, you make it one." I understood what she was saying, and I understood that she was asking me to make an impossible choice. But I also understood that I hadn't called her to ask permission to investigate. I'd called her to let her know what I'd found, and that was different. "I need to understand it," I said. "I need to know what it is." There was a long silence on the line. "It's old," Margaret finally said. "Older than recorded history in that region, probably. The indigenous peoples called it the Wendigo. Not a monster, a force, a winter hunger given form. The creature you're dealing with might be a remnant, or it might be something that just wears the same shape. I don't know. But I know that people who've encountered it before either left the territory or learned to coexist with it." "And David?" I asked. "David went too deep," Margaret said. "He tried to do what you're doing. He wanted to understand it. Last report was that he made it as far as the ravine before he came back out, pale, frostbitten, talking about cold that didn't follow the normal rules. He put in a transfer request 2 days later. I spent the next day preparing more carefully. I gathered supplies for a deeper expedition: thermal clothing, high-calorie food, extra water, medical supplies for potential cold-related injuries, and rope. I had no clear objective. I was driven by something that wasn't quite professional curiosity and wasn't quite survival instinct. It was something older than that. A need to confront the thing that had tracked me, that had tried to mimic my name, that had stood in the shadows of the forest and made a choice not to kill me. I wanted to know why. The hike to the ravine took most of a day. As I got closer, I noticed the forest changing. The trees became sparser in an unnatural way, as if something had cleared them deliberately. The undergrowth died off, and the temperature dropped steadily despite it being only mid-September and despite my exertion. By the time I reached the ravine's edge, my breath was misting in front of my face, and my exposed skin was burning with cold. The ravine was deeper than I'd expected, probably 200 feet down to the bottom, with walls of stone and ice even though there had been no snow that year. At the bottom I could see what might have been water, dark and still, and what might have been movement. The air coming up from the ravine smelled like old meat and something else. Something chemical and wrong. I set up a camp at the ravine's edge, secured my rope to a sturdy tree, and prepared to descend. Every instinct I had screamed at me not to go down. Every survival training I'd ever received told me that the ravine was a death trap, but I climbed down anyway. The walls were slick with something I didn't want to examine too closely. Ice, yes, but underneath the ice was something that felt like organic material, and when I touched it with my bare hand it was warm. Wrong. A pocket of impossible heat in the freezing air. About halfway down I heard the sound. It wasn't the creature's voice, it was other voices. Multiple voices, overlapping, all of them almost human, all of them distorted. They were coming from the walls of the ravine itself. And as my eyes adjusted, I realized why. The walls weren't stone. What I'd taken for irregular rock formations were something else. Shapes, humanoid shapes, or what had been humanoid shapes now partly fused into the walls themselves. Some were more recent. I could still see clothing, could still see recognizable human features. Others were ancient, worn smooth by age, barely distinguishable from the stone. I was staring at a graveyard, or a museum, or something that had no name. I counted 17 bodies before I stopped counting. The voices were still coming, echoing from those fused shapes, a chorus of almost words, all trying to form language, all nearly succeeding. I realized with horror that they weren't entirely dead. The creature kept them somehow, pressed into its dwelling place, still trying to speak even after everything else about them had ceased to exist. I climbed back up without thinking, without any memory of how I got my hands on the rope or how I managed to pull myself out. I was out of that ravine and moving north, away from my camp, away from the territory, running on pure panic. I made it maybe a mile before I collapsed. I was hypothermic. I knew the signs. The shivering had stopped. My movements were sluggish. My mind felt fuzzy. I descended into the cold and then climbed out of it, and the thermal shock had compromised my core temperature. I needed shelter and warmth, and I needed them immediately. There was an old structure nearby, something that might have been a ranger station or a hunting lodge from decades past. I broke my way inside and found dry wood and old supplies. I built a fire in the fireplace and wrapped myself in whatever blankets hadn't rotted away. I saved my life by a margin measured in degrees. And that night, as I lay by the fire, the creature came again. It didn't try to enter. It sat outside, at the edge of the light, and watched me. And when I was warm enough to move, when my mind was clear enough to think, I understood something. It had let me find the ravine. It had wanted me to know what it did with the things it caught. It was showing me the consequence of trespassing in its territory. And now it was giving me a choice. Leave or join the others in the walls. The creature didn't move for hours. It just sat there, patient and immense, its angular frame silhouetted against the darkness beyond the firelight. Sometimes it would make a sound, not the distorted voice mimicry I'd heard before, but something deeper, a subsonic rumble that I felt in my chest more than heard with my ears. A sound that suggested vast age and infinite hunger. I had a rifle. It was loaded with standard ammunition. I had no illusions about what that would do to the thing outside, but I kept it close anyway. The weight of it was comfort enough. Sometime around midnight, the creature stood. It was massive, taller now that I could see it fully, nearly 7 feet, with a frame that suggested terrible strength. It raised one elongated arm and pointed directly at me. Then it walked away into the forest, slow and methodical, each footfall deliberate. Within minutes, the sound of its movement had faded into silence. I didn't sleep. I kept the fire burning through the night and listened to the forest. There were other sounds, smaller creatures, wind, branches shifting, but nothing that suggested the thing was coming back. Still, when dawn came, I didn't feel relief. I felt like something had shifted, like the terms of my existence in that forest had fundamentally changed. I spent the next day thinking about what I'd seen in the ravine. Not the dead, though they haunted me, but the architecture of it. The way those bodies had been incorporated into the stone walls, how they'd been preserved in some manner that kept them from fully decomposing. I'd spent years studying biology, and I couldn't explain it. The process required either a technology or a biological process that existed outside conventional understanding. The creature was doing something to them, something that kept them in a state between life and death, conscious enough to attempt language, trapped enough that they could never escape. By evening, I'd made a decision. I was going to descend into the ravine again, not to save anyone, they were far beyond saving, but to understand, to see if there was any pattern to what the creature had done, any logic beyond simple predation. Margaret had called the creature a force, a manifestation of winter hunger, but forces don't have intention. The thing I'd encountered had intention in abundance. I gathered my supplies and moved camp back toward the ravine. This time I set up a more permanent base, a shelter with supplies, marked clearly so I could find my way back, and I created careful notes about what I'd seen, which I secured in a waterproof container with instructions that if I didn't return within 7 days, the whole package should be sent to the regional office. The creature watched me work from the edges of the cleared area. It never got closer than 50 yards, and it never made a sound. It was giving me space to make my choices, which somehow was worse than any direct threat. The second descent into the ravine was harder. Knowing what I'd find made every step feel like a violation. I'd brought better equipment, stronger rope, a more reliable harness, and a camera with a high-capacity battery. I was going to document what was down there. I made it further this time before the cold became overwhelming. The ravine was even colder in the daylight, or perhaps the daylight made me realize just how impossibly cold it was. My breath froze almost instantly. My fingers went numb within minutes. But I was prepared, and I moved carefully through the frozen chamber with my camera, taking images of everything. The bodies, the 17 I'd partially counted before, were arranged in a pattern. I realized this as I descended further. They weren't random. They were positioned in a spiral, oldest at the deepest part of the ravine, newest closer to the surface. It was a timeline, a record. I photographed the newest ones carefully. There was clothing that dated to the 1970s, a backpack from the 1980s, a modern jacket that couldn't have been more than 5 years old. David's jacket, I thought, though I couldn't be certain. At the very bottom of the ravine, I found something that made my blood run cold in a way the temperature alone never could. There was a journal, leather-bound, partially frozen but readable. I didn't open it fully. That felt like desecration, but I looked at enough to see the handwriting and to see the name on the cover. David Patterson. The ranger I'd replaced. He'd gone down into the ravine while still alive. The date on the last entry was 2 years ago. He'd written about the cold, about the way it felt like it was seeping into his mind as well as his body. He'd written about how the creature had explained itself to him, not with words, but with understanding that appeared directly in his consciousness. He'd written about how beautiful it was, the hunger, the eternal winter, the promise of never having to feel pain again because you'd simply cease to feel anything at all. And then he'd written, "I understand now. I'm going to stay." But David had left. He'd climbed out and he'd filed a transfer request and he'd run. He'd survived where someone else might not have. I climbed out of the ravine for the second time, and this time I could barely move. Hypothermia was setting in badly. My core temperature was dropping. My movements were slow and deliberate. My mind was starting to feel like it was moving through honey. I made it back to my shelter, got the fire going, and collapsed. When I woke up, the creature was inside with me. It was crouched by the fire, one long-fingered hand extended toward the warmth. It turned to look at me when I opened my eyes, and I saw something in that face that I'd been avoiding recognizing. Loneliness. It was profound and ancient and all-consuming. The creature had been alone in that forest for longer than any human could conceive. It had tried to communicate, it had tried to connect, and every time it did, it would hunt and kill and incorporate new subjects into its ravine, hoping that maybe this time, maybe with this one, it would finally achieve some form of connection that didn't lead to death. "You're dying," it said. The voice was clear, perfectly clear. It was a human voice. I recognized it as my own voice, actually, distorted but unmistakably mine. "You went into the ravine when you knew it would kill you," it continued. "That makes you different from the others. That makes you someone who understands." I wanted to run. I wanted to fight. Instead, I found myself sitting up slightly and meeting its gaze. "What are you?" I asked. The creature considered this, and for a moment I didn't think it was going to answer. When it did, the words came slowly, like it was still learning how to shape them. Old, it said finally. Lonely. Hungry. The forest remembers what I was, but I don't. I became something else. Something that needs to stay in the cold. Something that can't exist where the world is warm. The people in the ravine, I said. What do they become? Part of the forest, it said. Part of me. They're not suffering anymore. The cold takes that away. They just exist. They're remembered. Isn't that a form of immortality? I wanted to argue. I wanted to explain everything that was wrong with that logic, but I was too weak and the cold was still settling deeper into my bones, and I was starting to understand why David had come back down here, why he'd stayed as long as he had, because there was a kind of promise in it, an end to struggle. An end to the constant strain of staying alive in a world that demanded so much. The creature moved closer to me, and I didn't resist. I can make it quick, it said, and it sounded almost kind. Or I can make you part of the ravine. You could help me understand what I am. You could become the connection I've been looking for. I should have fought. Any sane human would have fought. Instead, I asked, how many of them are conscious? The creature made a sound, not quite speech, something deeper. Most, some. The older ones fade. The minds break after centuries. But they're not in pain. The cold ensures that. I thought about those 17 bodies, and the countless more that must lie deeper in the ravine going back hundreds of years, perhaps much longer. I thought about David's journal and what he'd written about the hunger and the beauty of surrender, and I thought about being alone for centuries, watching your isolation grow deeper, while you slowly lost the ability to remember why being alone was painful in the first place. I asked the creature if I could have a day to think about my choice. It agreed, which I didn't expect. But as I thought about it, lying in that shelter, too weak to move far, burning through what little remaining body heat I had, I realized that the creature had already thought about this decision enough. It knew what it needed from me. Now it was waiting to see if I would volunteer or if it would have to take. There's a difference. The creature understood that difference. The next morning, I made my way back to the ranger station slowly. Every step was agony. My core temperature had started recovering, but the experience had left my body fragile. I moved with the careful deliberation of something that might break at any moment. The creature followed at a distance. It never came close enough to touch, but it was always visible. A shadow moving between the trees, a shape that never quite blended with the forest because it was fundamentally wrong for that landscape. By the time I reached the station, Margaret had already called 3 times. I ignored all of them until I was safe inside, until I'd warmed up properly, until I could think again. Then I called her back. I found David's journal, I said without preamble. In the ravine, there was a long pause. Is he dead or not dead? I'm not sure which. He went down into the ravine and chose to stay. I heard Margaret exhale slowly. Did you come back out to talk to me or to say goodbye? She asked. I considered lying. I considered telling her I was getting out, that I was done, that I was filing my own transfer request, but I was tired of lies. I came back to think, I said. The creature showed me something. It let me understand it, and now it's giving me a choice. What choice? It wants me to become part of the ravine, I said. It's been alone for so long that it's desperate for connection. It's tried to force that connection by hunting, by incorporating people into its territory, but it's learned that force doesn't work. It's asking me instead. And what are you going to do? I looked out the window at the creature, standing at the edge of the cleared area surrounding the station. It was still now, perfectly still. Patient in the way that only truly ancient things can be patient. I'm going to make a counteroffer, I said. Margaret was quiet. I could hear her thinking, and I could hear the moment she understood that she was no longer talking to a human who followed normal operational parameters. What kind of counteroffer? She asked carefully. The creature doesn't have to isolate itself in the ravine, I said. It doesn't have to hunt to create connections. There's a boundary. People have been crossing it for generations, coming deeper into the forest than they should. If it stayed within a certain territory, if it stopped incorporating new subjects, if it just existed, I could manage that. I could be a buffer, a liaison. That's not a job, Margaret said slowly. That's a life sentence. Yes, I said, but it's not in the ravine. It's not dead, and it gives the creature something it's been missing for maybe thousands of years. Someone who knows it isn't a monster, someone who understands the loneliness. I could hear Margaret making a decision on the other end of the line. I could hear her weighing options that I wasn't even aware existed. I'll need to loop in higher authority, she finally said. This is above my level. You understand that, right? I do, I said. But I'm not asking permission. I'm informing you of what's going to happen, Carter. The creature is old enough that it probably remembers when this land wasn't colonized, I interrupted. It's probably forgotten more about what it is than we've ever known about anything. It deserves better than to be hunted, and I paused, searching for the right words. I think maybe it deserves a friend. I hung up before Margaret could respond. Over the next 3 days, I established the boundaries. The creature and I developed an understanding, not through words, which it was still learning to use properly, but through something more fundamental. I could feel its thoughts sometimes, touching the edges of my consciousness, and I could project mine back in response. The boundary was north of the creek, as David's note had said. Everything north of the creek was the creature's territory. The southern side I would maintain and monitor. Anyone who crossed the boundary I would turn back. Anyone who couldn't be turned back, well, they would have made their choice. The creature agreed. It retreated north of the creek and took up residence in the deep forest, no longer coming to the station, no longer attempting to acquire new subjects. The ravine remained, with its 17 bodies, with its echoes of almost voices, but no new ones would be added. On the 4th day, a helicopter landed near the station. Uniformed personnel emerged. I was officially removed from my post and my credentials were revoked. I was taken into custody, though not harshly, and driven to a facility in Minneapolis. For a month, I was interviewed, psychologically evaluated. I told them everything about the creature, showed them the evidence I'd collected, the photos, the journal entries. They listened with the expressions of people hearing a story about something that doesn't exist. In the end, they concluded that I'd suffered a psychological break due to isolation. The creature was a delusion. The body I'd been alone with me, projecting. The ravine was a geological formation that my mind had interpreted as containing human remains. They gave me a medical discharge and a pension. They made it clear that I would never work for any government agency again, and they very carefully did not assign anyone new to the ranger station at the Boundary Waters. The sector was being reclassified. New protocols, restricted access. I'm writing this from a small house in Duluth. I kept a low profile, found work in a hardware store, tried to rebuild something like a normal life. But sometimes I get packages, supplies, equipment. They always arrive unsigned, always sent to a P.O. box that I check carefully for surveillance. And sometimes, on nights when the wind comes down from the north and carries the cold with it, I stand outside and I can feel the creature's presence. It's still there. It's still lonely. But it's patient. Last week I received a letter. It was written in my handwriting, but I didn't write it. The words came from somewhere else, filtered through a mind that was learning to use language as a tool rather than as prey. The letter said only, "Thank you for remembering that I was something before I became this. When you're ready to come back, I'll still be here." I haven't responded, but I'm working on resigning from the hardware store. The Boundary Waters are calling, and I don't think I can resist much longer. I don't think I want to, because the creature has shown me something true, that loneliness isn't a failure of the world. It's a failure of understanding. And maybe if I cross that boundary one more time, if I descend into the ravine while I'm still alive to choose it, we can both finally stop being alone. The cold is waiting. The forest remembers, and I find I'm not afraid anymore.